So I put this book up last week and suggested that you get it. I think it's helpful reading. You may not agree with everything that's in it, but everything I'm going to say in this class tonight came from that book. So might be helpful. I found it extremely helpful in going through the book of Revelation. So what is apocalyptic genre? Or what is apocalyptic literature? First of all, let me ask, when was most apocalyptic literature written? We talked about this Sunday.
Old Testament.
Okay, we have some in the Old Testament.
Times of trial.
Times of trial, but when specifically in history? Maybe that's a better way to say it.
Impending persecution, such as almost going to exile or going into exile.
Right. It is about writing about things in times of crisis, but a time of crisis for the Jews in particular was the intertestamental period, because they went from being under the Persians, and then the Greeks came, and then the Greeks divided up into 4 kings. We have one of those kings who went and desecrated the temple, created a war in Judea. When you think about it, Herod the Great was actually appointed by Antony and Cleopatra. So you can imagine the back and forth that went on just in the establishment of Rome. And so they wrote these books, uninspired men wrote these books with the idea of telling these people, not giving them a specific prophecy of what's going to take place, but reminding them that God is in control and that God is going to overcome in the end. And they would always remind them of a greater purpose than what was going on right at that time. We have some of the expired examples. Shane looked at Daniel and Ezekiel, but we could have looked at Zechariah. Anyone who's read Zechariah, you heard about the 4 horsemen in Zechariah, for example, which seems very similar to what we saw in Revelation. So uninspired books, I've never read them, but in that book I recommended you get long sections of examples from those books that kind of show you the similarity in the literature style between Revelation and, say, 2nd Baruch or 2nd Enoch or the War Scroll or the Apocalypse of Abraham. I have to tell you that until I read this book, I never even heard of 3 of those. So it's there's quite a bit that was floating around. So we just talked about it. Why is apocalyptic written? Well, it was always written in a time of crisis. It's always when there's intense persecution and trouble afflicting God's people. So, for example, when Antiochus Epiphanes, I think that's right, went and burned a pig on the altar and put Greek gods in the temple, that started a war. That was an intense time for God's people. And usually when people are suffering, they ask, well, why is God allowing good people to suffer? If He's in control, why is this happening to me? And the answer from God in an apocalypse is that I will, but history is a long story which is not over yet. And that there is a bright future coming for the faithful, but it's clear that in order to realize that bright future, you need to hold on and be faithful. And if you go through the book of Revelation, you're going to see that, right? So what would the original readers have expected? Well, the first thing is, it says there's a 2 worldview of life, right? There's what's going on right in front of you, but what's causing that? And what it's saying is that there are events going on in heaven that are causing the events that are happening on earth. So, for example, in Revelation, when Michael goes to war against Satan and his angels, and Satan and his angels lose, where does Satan go? In fact, where does Michael put him? You guys have read this, right?
Cast down to the earth.
Cast down to the earth. In fact, there are woes pronounced because Satan has been cast down to the earth. And if you go through it and we think about it, what does Satan do? He gathers up the world powers, creates a great beast that he gives his authority to, and then we're off to persecuting the church and Christians. There's always otherworldly characters. Revelation has got the cherubs, right? It's got angels. It's got Jesus talking to John. There's a journey, almost always. John's in Patmos, but in chapter 4, he sees a vision in heaven, and what happens? He's lifted up. He's actually commanded, come up here and look at this. There are signs and there are symbols. And we won't get into that because we're going to have a whole bunch of classes on the signs and the symbols. But what they do, they're designed to reveal secrets in an unforgettable way. So I'll ask you, the dragon waiting to devour the child of the woman who's in labor, is that easy to remember? Not hard to forget, is it? The solution to the crisis is proposed or promised in the apocalypse. God will crush evil and triumph. And there's always a cry for God's help. Wes mentioned it in his prayer, that which we see when the fifth seal is opened up and the saints are under the altar. And they're asking, it paints a picture that we're not comfortable with. Because why are those saints under the altar? They're martyrs. And how long is answered with an answer that we may not be comfortable with? Not until the full number of those who will be martyred are martyred. What we would like to hear is nobody else is going to die. Right? But that's not what it says. It has a survey of human history broken into periods, like we have 3 sets of visions. We have 3.5 years. We have 1,260 days. There's time periods mentioned. And the most important part of the apocalypse is that God wins, not by accident, but God wins every time he goes to battle, and he will do it without fail. Any questions about that? So that brings us to what apocalyptic does not do. So let me ask you, what do most, and I'm not talking about members of the church now. If I mention to you, you guys might not know him, Hal Lindsey, some of the older ones. Remember him? When did he say that the 1,000-year reign was going to start? 1988, because it would be 40 years after the establishment of Israel. What have we done with Hal Lindsey's prophecy or interpretation? Well, I pretty much don't pay any attention to it. Didn't in the first place, but when we got to 1989, that pretty much ended that. But there are other people today who write very specific prophecies based on Revelation, what's going to happen. But Revelation and Apocalyptic was never intended to be a book full of specific details about when things are going to happen. What it does tell us is some things that I think are very easy for us to understand. Evil will get worse and worse, and then God will absolutely crush it in complete triumph. Now that's a message that's clearly in there, right? Do we know when that's going to happen? No. But we know that it is going to happen. It's also a subset, so it is apocalyptic, but it's also a prophecy. Revelation 1:3 says that it is, but it's a prophetic apocalypse. And what I mean by that is that it looks to the end time. It says there will be a judgment at the end of time when God triumphs, not only over the beast, and the false prophet. And if you notice, there is a time frame in Revelation between the defeat of the beast and the false prophet and when Satan and his angels are cast into the lake of fire. So there is this idea that there's going to be this end-time judgment and end-time salvation. We looked at it last week. If you just went through the 7 churches, what word is repeated in every letter to the 7 churches, and it's repeated 7 times, excluding the phrase, and let everyone hear what the Spirit says to the churches. There's one word.
Is it overcome?
Or overcome or conquer. You have this idea that you need to hang on. You need to hang on, however, and you need to get ready. Some churches were told to repent so they could conquer. Some churches had a mixed group. They had some that needed to repent and some that needed to hold on. One needed to wake up in order to conquer. One, well, it needed to let Jesus in order to conquer. And so there is this idea that the world's going to end up at a time of judgment. Now, when we see bad going on, and we compare it to our current world, the only comparison we would make is this. Yes, all things are as expected. Evil is getting worse. We must pray that God will come soon and fix everything. And I have to tell you, I'm 60, he's 64 in October, and I think anyone who's lived any time at all on the earth, is it better or worse? And if you study history, are things better or worse? What's happening? It's always getting worse. Don't you guys all talk at once tonight? It makes me nervous. Revelation is not a timetable or a calendar for Jesus' return. If you're trying to go in there and parse this out and figure out the exact time when Jesus is going to come, you're going to fail just like everyone else has. Because if you look at the times, they don't correspond to historic times. Okay? But what time does do is it reinforces the message, wait, what is happening now is not the whole story. God is in control. God rules over everything, including time. It does not predict a future hundreds of years from now. Now, I want to qualify that statement a little bit. When was this written? And when it was written, when did it say things were going to happen? Soon, quickly, right? We could go through all the passages that say that. But it's also clear that near the end of the book, it's talking about something in the distant future. When we read Old Testament prophets, how do they talk about things?
Prophetic perfect.
Okay, explain that, Wes. Prophetic perfect.
Now and in the future as well.
Now and in the future as well. I had this, I think Bob Hartwriter was responsible for this, but he had a drawing. And he said it's like going to an overlook on the mountains. You can see the mountains in front of you very clearly, but you can also see that there are mountains out in the distance that you can't see so clearly. And that prophecy is just like that. I mean, when I spoke on the prophet Joel talked about what was happening right now, but he also talked about what was going to happen in the future. Revelation does the same thing. The other thing is, and this is what disturbs me about what some people try to do with Revelation, is it's not a book about doctrinal truth that's buried inside of its symbols and metaphors. It's not like Romans. It's not like 1 Peter. It's a book that talks about, you're in a world of hurt, and here's how God's going to fix it. Now, there's imagery in apocalyptic literature. So, what happens when somebody, like if you go and look in like when Hal Lindsey did his word. What he was doing is he was parsing all these symbols out. You know the locusts that are described with breastplates of gold and faces like lions? Well, those were attack helicopters. What apocalyptic does not do is not everything in the vision means to mean something. I'll give you a good example. When do we mess up Jesus' parables? How do we mess them up?
Turning them into an allegory.
Yeah, turn it into an allegory. Try to use everything that Jesus says in the parable to mean something. But quite often, Jesus would say, here's what it means. And the rest of it was just, what? Background? To paint a word picture for us. A lot of what you see in a vision in Revelation are word pictures for you to see a scene. Okay? Here's how some people go crazy, though. There was one preacher who took Revelation 5:11, where it said 10,000 times 10,000. And he said what that means is 100 million will be in heaven. And he's making it very literal. Was it designed to be that way? If you hear 10,000 times 10,000, I think the newer versions all say myriads of myriads. What's the picture that's being painted? So many you can't even really count, right? That is just overwhelming. But what we should do with an image, though, is stand back for a panoramic view. Now, I think last Wednesday night, before the baby came, Shane said that when you look at things in Ezekiel, it's like looking at a giant mural. And the same thing is true here. If you go see Cyclorama, how many people have ever seen the Cyclorama in Atlanta? So is that like an accurate movie or more like a mural in the round? It's a mural in the round. It shows you the Battle of Atlanta, but it's not meant to be something that you look at and you see everything as it exactly happened. That's the same thing with Revelation. So for example, many visions are described in vivid detail. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's a situation where in one vision, John sees a temple in heaven. But at the end of the book, he says there is no temple in heaven because God is the temple. Now, the reason that happens in apocalyptic literature is because you're seeing a different picture, a different scene, okay? Any beasts or animals in Revelation? It's usually full of fantastic beasts and animals. Here's how we ought to look at it. The overall picture matters, but not the details. Here's what we can do when we get buried in the vision. I'm in a flower garden, and I'm looking at a petal on a rose. What am I missing?
The flower.
You're missing the flower.
Rest of the flower.
And you're missing the garden. You don't even know where you are. You're just looking at this petal. What picture were you supposed to get? When I went to Europe, one of the things that's really cool over there is all the manors had these huge gardens. And they were laid out with lots of beautiful plants. The first thing you were supposed to be impressed with was the garden. And the walls, and how pretty it was. And you say, wow, this is a really beautiful place. I never really spent much time looking at individual petals, because the whole point of the garden was this peaceful place that had, and that's the same kind of thing with apocalyptic. You need to look at the vision and be impressed. Right? Now, what do we do with things in visions? How do we know what God wants us to understand from it? Well, I'll tell you what, let's look at chapter 4 of Revelation, and I'll give you an excellent example of how we're supposed to look at the vision. So, starting in verse 1. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper, carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, and rumblings, and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning the 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. Out of that entire vision, what is the one thing that you are told what it is?
Door standing open.
Well, that's part of the vision, but yeah, it is telling you it's a door.
20,000 others.
7 lamps.
The 7,
Lamps, which are the 7 spirits of God.
yeah, that is explained. What do you think we're supposed to concentrate on besides the fact how great God is? Why doesn't it tell me what the rainbow means? Or carnelian? Or why doesn't he explain all those things? What's the one thing he wants you to be impressed with? The thing that's going to be operable throughout Revelation. The 7 spirits of God. You get the same thing in chapter 7, when there's a great multitude. Right? What happens there? Let's go over there and look at that. 9 through 17. We won't go through all of it, but here's what I'd like for you to see. Verse 13. They see this great multitude. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, and here's something we need to pay attention to, because he says, the elder who says, Who are these, clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? And John goes, I don't really know, but you know. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Do we know what we're supposed to pay attention to there? Did he explain to us who the great multitude in heaven is? That's the point. Apocalyptic literature will always explain what is actually important in the vision. The other thing is, and this is hard for me being a software engineer, but apocalyptic is not governed by logic. It's poetry. It took me a long time to appreciate the Psalms because I don't think like that. But somebody who is artistic looking at the Psalms will be impressed with their beauty. And I had to begin to learn that even David took poetic license. So I'm not looking for doctrine in Psalms. I'm looking for something completely different. But one thing apocalyptic does, and something I think we need to take as a lesson to us, is that apocalyptic is black and white in its worldview. There's only 2 groups. Do you know who the 2 groups are in Revelation?
Those who have the mark of the beast and those who have the mark of God.
That's right. And by the way, you get the mark of the beast and the mark in your hand, the mark of the beast on your hand or forehead by default if you don't choose to follow God. That's a little bit of a tough lesson, but there's no gray area in Revelation. There's only two groups. But apocalyptic is also a visual genre. And we touched on this a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but movies have formulas. What's going to happen in a chick flick?
Good guys coming and they'll fall in love.
That's right. And what always happens at the end? The good guy and the girl are together. We'd be really upset if right at the end, a slasher came up and killed the good guy, because that's not the formula for a chick flick. But in a horror movie, the slasher is expected. If there isn't one, we're all upset because there's nobody there to do anything bad. What about action movies? Do you expect a big love story in the middle of it? Not really. If there is one, it's kind of incidental and very superficial, right? We know what's going to happen when we go to those movies. We know what to expect because there's a formula for that. There's also a formula for apocalyptic. But here, what's different from this and a movie, and this is something I think hurts our time, is that we're supposed to use our imagination. We hear word pictures. So, just for, well, we won't look these up, but the word show occurs 5 times in Revelation. The word see occurs 9 times. The word saw occurs 44 times. And I didn't put this up there, but you notice when we read the whole book, one word that came out all the time is John would say, it's like this, or it's like that, or it's like this. Why is he saying that? What's he doing? Not so much, well, he's comparing, but why is he comparing?
So we can understand better.
Yeah, he's trying to put it in terms that people would know what he's looking at. He's trying to paint word pictures for us of the vision he's looking at. Now, what that can mean is, I don't think he's trying to put the heavenly in earthly terms. Does that make sense? So we have to use our brain. You know, when the Harry Potter movies came out, I had listened to all the Harry Potter books read by someone because I wanted to know what my kids are all excited about and what are they reading, and I could talk to them about it. Then the movies came out, and I was extremely disappointed in the movies because I had heard this man read these stories all the way through, and I had pictures in my head of what it would look like. And then it didn't look like that in the movies. I think sometimes when people say, I would like a visual representation of what I'm seeing in Revelation, maybe that's not good. Maybe we're all supposed to have a picture in there that keeps us impressed with what's going on. So we said there are rules for movies. There can be rules for apocalyptic visions as well. The message in it is for the people in the time that received it. Who is the letter? I'm sorry, who is the prophecy? Well, it is a letter. Who is Revelation written to? Correct, the church. 7 churches of Asia. Now, we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but if you think about that, it was also a circular letter, right? So it was written, and it was specifically to be read among those 7 churches, and I don't know how happy I would have been if I had been in Sardis to know that the others were going to read about me, especially with what Jesus had to say. But each one of those 7 letters is an introduction to the book, to the apocalypse that's coming. But it's written about the situation they're in and how that's going to be resolved over time. Now, one way you can look at it, and this has been traditionally said, Revelation offers help and comfort to its first century readers. It does and it doesn't. It's also a warning. Because if you're the church in Ephesus, and Jesus says, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. And I'm calling on you to repent. And the only way that you're going to conquer and overcome and inherit eternal life is to repent. Is that a warning or comfort? But if you're the church in Smyrna, where you're about to undergo persecution for 10 days, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life to him who overcomes. He will escape the second death. Would that be comforting? No. It's not designed for an autopsy. Now, we've kind of gone over this a lot, but when you think about a movie, what is the meaning behind Star Wars? It starts to lose. Star Wars is just a shoot 'em up in space, right? What's it designed to do? Be a good time. Well, a little bit, we don't want to dissect Revelation because I'm supposed to be impressed with the beast and the false prophet and how evil they are. Or what about the harlot that rides on the beast? What am I supposed to think of her? John, it says, marveled at her when he saw her. The vision he saw was overwhelming to him. I like what I believe is the angel said. Why are you marveling at her? But he was impressed. He saw this vision. Apocalyptic doesn't have interchangeable parts. In other words, simplify this. Who wears black hats in cowboy movies or westerns or used to? The bad guys. One bad guy. And if the first western you ever see is black-hatted guys robbing the bank, does that mean that in the next western, the black hat guys are going to rob the bank? It could mean they're going to kidnap a girl or do something else nefarious. What we do expect of black-hatted guys is to do something nefarious. And so one thing that we want to be careful of is that when we compare metaphors in the Bible, we've got to be careful in doing that. So I'll give you a prime example. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5 that he used leaven as a metaphor for how sin can affect the church. But in Matthew 13:33, Jesus used leaven to talk about the effect of the kingdom of heaven in the world. So you can't always say leaven is bad. You also can't say leaven is always good. But the metaphor was used for how it works, right? Each apocalyptic vision must be allowed to stand on its own. So we mentioned this already. The use of the temple, the tabernacle, and Revelation. Did you know the temple and the tabernacle are both mentioned? And yet when you get to heaven, there's no temple. Because God is the temple. And Revelation should be watched in one sitting. One thing that I heard from people after we read through Revelation in 2 classes is that was really good to read it that way. Because I hadn't heard it. Well, if you think about it, at least in ESV it says that it should be read aloud. Why do you think it should be read aloud? Because it's painting pictures. There's a whole story. Revelation from start to finish is a story. And that's how we should view it. So how can we understand Revelation as we go through it? And I'm really going to be trying to use some of these ideas as we go through it. The first thing is, let less be more. It was not written to contain carefully finessed doctrines of the end time. And it was not written in a secret code, waiting thousands of years until someone found the magic decoder ring and necessary so that today's readers can understand it. It wasn't written to give esoteric forecasts of distant world events that no first century reader would ever care about. You think that if I were in Ephesus, I would be comforted to know that God is going to overcome the Nazis or defeat Red China? That was not what their problem was. So trying to force Revelation to do more than apocalyptic literature is meant to do can only lead to an interpretive disaster. So while we're reading this and studying, I want to keep the main thing the main thing. So there are some things to think about. Who's in control? God. And what is he giving this revelation for?
Comfort Christians being persecuted.
Well, to encourage them, right, during this persecution, to persevere and remain faithful. Because what he's telling them is, you can't see the end from where we are right now, but I'm telling you that I'm going to bring justice for you. I'm going to judge the beast and the false prophet and the harlot, and I'm going to defeat them, and I'm going to bring them and everyone to judgment. I think, Michael, I think it was, wrote to me and said he had not noticed, but when we read the whole book and we got to Revelation 21, verse 8, the first sin that was mentioned that would keep someone out of heaven was being a coward. I don't think that means didn't want to get in a fight. I think it was did not stand up for Jesus in the midst of that persecution. Then the other thing to remember is that God is sovereign, so be faithful. Not to be trite, but here's the message of Revelation. Jesus and the devil got in a fight, and who won? Jesus. So if you got the message that God's power, might, control over all things is an encouragement to remain true to him, then you understand the book. Now, the other piece is never forget the time frame of apocalyptic literature. Where did messes come from like premillennialism? Because they weren't focused on when these things were supposed to happen. When were they supposed to happen? Soon and quickly. Soon is used 8 times in the book. It's stressed over and over again. Now, that might be prophetic soon, not our soon, but it does claim that things are going to happen soon. And this last one, the reader must allow its truths to work in his or her life. I want to give you something to think about, because this came out in my study this week. And I had not noticed it before, but it's central to the message of Revelation. How do the persecuted overcome?
Blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony.
Yes. How did Jesus overcome? God's testimony, his death, and his blood. He gained victory over sin, victory over death through the resurrection. Why do we believe Jesus' testimony?
Because he was raised.
Pardon me?
Because he was raised.
Because he was raised and went to his death. Why do we believe the apostles' testimony?
Killed him.
Yeah, who denied him after his resurrection? Not a one. One of the messages of Revelation is, do you know how we're going to convert people in the first century? Why did Christianity win? I mean, if you really think about it, the Roman Empire did about everything it could to stamp it out. When a Christian was put to death, was that a private ceremony or a public ceremony? All you gotta do is go back and read history and the church fathers, and one of the things that impressed the Romans was these people were willing to die for what they believed because they believed they were going to heaven. They believed there would be another life. And when people saw that happen time after time after time after time, it started to win hearts. So when the book says that you will overcome by the testimony of Jesus and by the blood of the Lamb, and it says things like, they did not love their life even unto death, what is it saying? And does that shed any light on what Jesus said about bearing his cross and following him? We like to spiritualize that, and it does have a spiritual application, but does it also have a real world application? In the fact of that what Revelation is trying to do is stress to us, make that decision that you will die for the testimony of Jesus so that you can overcome by the blood of the Lamb. Is that something we can use in our lives? All right. So, Sunday we'll talk about some of what some people think Revelation means. What I would like for you to do is an exercise that you're going to do several times through this class. Go back through the entire book and write down, get yourself a little notebook and write down how many repeated sentences you can find or phrases. And see if you see anything in those repeated sentences and phrases. Thank you.